Welcome to the Toastmasters podcast, the official podcast of Toastmasters International. Hello, everybody. This is Greg Gazin. Across Africa, Toastmasters has seen remarkable growth in recent years, not just in numbers, but in leadership, visibility, and global impact. But what's less obvious is why that growth happened and what made it stick. My guest today has had a front row seat to that transformation and is one of many people who played a role in shaping it. Frank Tsuro works with first-generation leaders, people who rose to the top through talent and grit, but never received the leadership playbook others inherit, the language, the networks, and the mentors that many take for granted. As a Toastmasters past international director, Frank has seen firsthand what becomes possible when leaders finally gain exactly that: the communication, the confidence, and the connections that Toastmasters unlocks. A Toastmaster since 2012, Frank is a dual member of the Entrepreneurs Club and the L'Avenir Toastmasters Club, both based in Johannesburg. He lives between Harare, Zimbabwe, and Johannesburg, South Africa, and spends his time in both locations. Frank is one of the members featured in Africa's Ascent. The continent has soared in Toastmasters growth, visibility, and performance. Paul Sturman's article in the April 2026 issue of the Toastmaster magazine. Coming to us today from Johannesburg, South Africa, Frank Tsuro. Welcome to the Toastmasters podcast.
Thank you for having me, and greetings, Toastmasters from around the world.
Frank, clubs are always looking for new members, and I know that many are still feeling the pinch from COVID. But when I read Paul's article and I saw the stats, these are 2014 to 2024 stats, and seeing that parts of Africa are seeing double and triple digit growth, while cumulatively the world has actually lost about 3% over that same time period, I'm actually just blown away. So, Frank, when you look back, what do you really think changed the trajectory of Toastmasters growth in your part of Africa?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there was just always potential in Africa. To think that the first club in Africa was started in Johannesburg in 1950. And interestingly, it was a Canadian whose company transferred him to Johannesburg, and they started the first club in 1950. But by the time we got to the early 2010s, we actually still had only one district in Africa. And in that one district in Africa, we actually had most of our clubs. In fact, almost over 100 of the 120 clubs were just in South Africa. Now, I know for some people, Africa is South Africa, but Africa is more than just one country. Africa is 54 sovereign nations. And so there
Wow.
were 53 other nations who still needed a lot of Toastmasters. And I think that in itself was quite an opportunity to seize. But I think another dynamic that's worth thinking about when it comes to the growth of Africa, largely because Africa in the 20th century came out of the colonialism, what you find is most African countries today do business in English or French, and there are a few other languages like Swahili or Portuguese that come through. But many Africans are not first or second language English speakers or French speakers, and yet they need to do business in English, French, Portuguese, and all these other colonial languages. And so Toastmasters presented an opportunity for people to not only practice their English, but to actually join the African continent by getting people to communicate with each other. I'll end with an African saying, an African proverb that we have, which is when the desirable is not available, the available becomes desirable. I know that in North America, in Europe, many people have got so many options to actually study communication, whether it's at a Dale Carnegie or a university. What makes Toastmasters unique is it provides a high quality program, which is very cost effective. And I think when you join all those opportunities and more, Africa, it was just a matter of time before Toastmasters in Africa grew to the levels that we're seeing at this point.
Was there a particular event or something that happened, or was it a realization that really started helping it to take off?
Well, I think there are a number of champions that we're going to talk about, during this podcast that really made things very possible. Past international director Beth Thomas, that was instrumental in starting Toastmasters in East Africa. We also had a presence in West Africa, even though in 2010, in fact, up until 2013, the West Africa was undistricted. We still had people that were now making efforts to grow Toastmasters. But in the one established district that we had a very important visit from past international president Pat Johnson, just changed the trajectory of everything. In fact, I only joined Toastmasters in 2012, but the impact of that event in 2010 before I joined is something that was shared to us through oral tradition in terms of how impactful it was. And a bit of the context to that story is that at the time, we had a couple of clubs in Mauritius on the Indian Ocean island, just east of Africa. They wanted to be part of a district so that they could enjoy the benefits of becoming districted. However, at the time, the board of directors assessed the way our district was currently performing, and they discovered that of the 9 countries that were in my district, Toastmasters was still very predominant in South Africa. In fact, more than 100 of the 125 clubs were in one country, which is South Africa. And the board felt that the district needed to demonstrate its ability to grow in the other countries before they allow the addition of another country to the district. And I think that became motivation. And when past international President Johnson came to South Africa for that district visit, I think many of our leaders were ready to have someone guide them through a multi-year plan that would actually make it possible to grow Toastmasters in all corners of the continent. And I think that really made a very big difference in everything. And today, we know that that event was powerful because the greater vision at the time was to have 2 healthy districts in Southern Africa by 2016. And even though up until it didn't take us up until 2024 to then get a second district, I think that was pivotal to the growth that we saw in Southern Africa, that then also the fire went to West Africa. And now we talk of 5 districts in Africa, and Africa being pretty much its own region. So I think that visit from past international President Johnson was very significant in making things work. And the last thing I'll say, which is also in the article, our current international president, Aleta Rochab, at that time she was not even on the trio, was the host to past international President Johnson. And that visit apparently inspired her to go further in a Toastmasters leadership journey. And now she's our international president. So I believe that that visit did not just benefit South Africa or Southern Africa or Africa, but it benefited the world of Toastmasters.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Of course, if you know Pat Johnson, she is certainly known for making things happen. In fact, she's also a fellow Canadian from British Columbia, Canada, and also she was the international president in 2010. I recall that very well because I was a district governor that year. Is there a thought or a moment or something that maybe she said or did that was memorable?
Well, like I said, I wasn't there, so I will stay away from quoting specifics. But I do know that she definitely did facilitate the multi-year plan that was behind our success. In fact, for some leaders that often ask me, "How were you able to achieve so much success during my time as a district leader and during the last decade?" I think the difference is many districts try and achieve on the district recognition program year on year and come up with new plans every year. We had one multi-year plan that was active from the first time I became an area governor or an area director, as we call it right now, to the time I left district leadership as an immediate past district director. And that continuity is something that really made things possible. And we owe that multi-year planning or that multi-year plan initiative to past President Johnson.
That's great. Formulate the plan, execute the plan. That's great. And it looks like it's paid off, because even in the article it makes mention of, in the last decade, Africa has produced 8 region advisors, 3 international directors, and then of course there is the world champs, Verity Price
Yeah,
from South Africa, Cyril Junior Dim. I think he was originally from Zimbabwe. I think he lives in Poland now.
he is from Zimbabwe, yeah, but based in Europe.
And then of course Madam President Rashat. That's awesome. What do you think that says about what's happening across the continent?
I think it tells us that Africa is indeed leading the way. I don't know if you know this, but Africa right now has the youngest population in the world. I think the average in North America is just under 40, maybe 39, and it's slightly more in Europe, which is 43. For us, it's 19 years old. And by 2050, Africa, all the countries in Africa are predicted to be 25% of the world's population. And that really puts us in the realm of where India and China are right now in terms of the organization. So I think there's just so much opportunity to come from Africa. And I think there's many opportunities, not just for Toastmasters, but even for you as an individual to come and invest in the continent and see the amazing talents that the continent has to showcase.
You yourself was a leader at a very young age.
Yes, I'm quite privileged to have known about Toastmasters very early in my life, and I'm also lucky to. Ever since I became a district leader, in fact, I joined right as I said. Part of that multi-year plan was to develop a pipeline of leaders. At the time, they were looking for young people who who were just willing and able to commit to the organization and help the organization grow. I often say that I find myself where I am today in Toastmasters, not because I had any special qualifications, but because I was just willing and happy to participate. I found that I got so many opportunities to meet past presidents. I remember at my first Toastmasters conference, the district leadership team exposed me to then past president George Yen, who was just passing through South Africa on his way to a visit to Nigeria. And, it's those exposures that inspire you to go further. And by the time I became the district director, I was the youngest district director that my district had had. The age gap was quite huge. And after people saw me in that position, I think many young people saw themselves in me and they thought, if he can do it, I'm sure I can do it. And ever since then, we've just had a multitude of young people who are really, just coming up with new ideas and moving the organization forward. So I'm very excited to see where our young leadership, mixed with, of course, our experienced members, are going to take Toastmasters to the entire world.
I'm reading that was in 2018 and you're only 27 years old. That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's perfect, because that was the question I was going to ask you, is wondering whether or not it was the changing demographic that had something to do with the growth. And I know that many districts, and even in my local district, when you go to meetings and you go to conferences, you see fewer younger people, and the whole idea is to try to get more younger people in there, because younger people are also our future leaders.
Yeah, definitely demographic change was quite crucial. But like I said, it's very important up until today. In fact, when we look at Toastmasters in Africa, it's easier to look at it in regions. So there's the southern part of Africa, then there's the western side of Africa, then we've got North Africa, which currently is aligned to the districts in Europe, and then we have East Africa. In each location, I think the coming in of young leaders really made a difference, but also partly because I spoke about, transitioning from colonial times. A lot of the majority of our population were in an age where they were trying to build careers. And so understanding volunteerism was not something that was second nature. So for a long time, Toastmasters was only available to the minority. And I remember one of the early days that I joined Toastmasters, there was a story about one of the most popular townships in South Africa called Soweto, the southwestern townships where the great Nelson Mandela used to live. I remember we had a number of Toastmasters who went to try and start a club in that township, and people there were asking, how much will you pay us to start a club and to run a club? And that's because people weren't familiar with the concept. But once the demographics started changing and they started seeing people like them and started understanding the importance of investing in yourself in some of these extracurricular activities beyond church, which is quite big in Africa religion, I think that's also what drove the growth in Africa. And I think our best times are yet to come despite this major growth.
There's something that really stands out in the article. You describe leaders as being almost like missionaries. Does that fit into what you're talking about? And what did you mean by that?
Yes, when I got elected into the trio as club growth director, one of in fact, my predecessor on the trio, Keith Bowen and I, were well known to love road trips. So we would rather drive, 1,500 kilometers or just over 1,000 miles to any part of the world. And because on those road trips on our way to Toastmasters, we always had stopovers. And at some point, we started thinking of ourselves as missionaries because everywhere we stopped, we just thought maybe we could close the gap and start a Toastmasters club here. So, yes, we did adopt the missionary mindset. It worked for colonialism, and we can definitely innovate and apply it to something positive like Toastmasters. So, yes, that's how we thought about it.
This might be a great time to find out about how you got started. How did you discover Toastmasters? And I understand that you were heading off to the races as soon as you started.
Okay, yeah. So I was quite lucky to know Toastmasters from high school because we had a Toastmasters club, except that Toastmasters club didn't quite, I don't think it was mission aligned with what Toastmasters exactly does. We did enjoy toasting, as students, but we always did so many other things. So one day I was listening to the radio and I heard someone talk about Toastmasters. And at that time, I was starting to be a chartered accountant, or what you call a CPA in North America. And so I just needed something else in my life that would just bring balance to my life. And so when Toastmasters came about, I quickly thought, you know what, let me go and visit a Toastmasters club. To my surprise, the first time I got to Toastmasters, I was a bit surprised and taken aback because previously, when I was part of a public speaking club, or what we used to call Toastmasters, it was elitist. You couldn't be part of a public speaking club if you couldn't speak. So I was surprised to see people learning how to speak. And I think it's once I understood what the real mission was behind Toastmasters because of that set or that experience of being taken aback, I think that's why the mission stuck quite a lot. And I became very committed to helping everyone find their voice.
And you were really into the contests, right?
Yes, yes. So I joined Toastmasters partly because I wanted to be a world champion of public speaking. And in fact, that was my only focus. But as life would have it, I accidentally found myself in leadership, and there's a bit of a funny story behind it. And I wanted to contest, and at the time, no one in my club was prepared to plan a contest. I decided that, you know what, I'll plan the contest. And then when I finish planning the contest, I will relinquish my role as contest chairman. And then after that, I'll compete. But of course, I had not read policy. And someone read it at the 11th hour that, well, if you are the contest chairperson or the person that plans the contest, you cannot be in that contest. And of course, I was gutted and that I couldn't compete. But at that point, people who then attended our club contest really loved what they saw, and they'd not seen a contest actually managed at that level. Well, partly because I had the energy and passion for the contest. The area director at the time then said, well, if you want to know how to run a good contest, you must call a young guy called Frank. Before I knew it, I planned most of the club contests in my area. And before I knew it, my area director gave me an opportunity to plan the area contest. And I think because of that entire contest incident, people started to see me as a leader because I was an authority in contest and they saw me as a leader. So before I knew it, as Toastmasters are well known to do, people invited me to step up and lead. Yeah, ever since then, I've never had the opportunity to actually contest even at club level in the international speech contest. But I do hope that one day, when I take a sabbatical from leadership, I can fulfill my dream of being in the international speech contest. And who knows?
Yeah, you never know, but I'm sure many people are very happy that you decided to take that one fork in the road and you decided to go in that one direction. I was doing when I was doing my research for this episode, I discovered that you and your brother Andrew were referred to, or you were mentioned in the Family Ties in Toastmasters article back in December of 2025. And you, even then, you were talking about being on a mission. And I'll just read this quote here. We are on a mission to redefine leadership in Africa by creating young, ethical, and smart leaders. We call them yes leaders to contribute to developing the continent at the grassroots level.
Yes, yes. So, in fact, speaking about earlier, we were talking about missionary, being missionaries. And one thing I discovered was that in one of the towns, in one of the cities I'd grown up in, we didn't have Toastmasters. And so at the time, I was the area director and needed to start a club in my hometown, or at least in the city that I grew up. I needed an anchor, someone on the ground that could help me logistically. And so my brother at the time, there was probably an incentive to run away from kitchen duty at night. So he became a target, and I think it was a good proposal to him. He came and started getting involved in Toastmasters, helping me set up that club, which and now we've got more than an area in my own home city. So yeah, we managed to both get involved in Toastmasters. But when I was in school, I was a big history. I enjoyed history, and in Southern Africa, there's a textbook that we use for history, and it's called People Making History. And People Making History is a book that literally parades and shares the stories of the icons of liberation in Africa. People like Nelson Mandela, some people like Samora Machel in Mozambique, and many other, Julius Nyerere, and a few other iconic leaders in Africa. When you read these stories, you couldn't help but be inspired that these people sacrificed their own lives, which for some of them were already good lives, and they sacrificed to liberate other people. And I felt that some of the people who were heroes at the time died villains because they reversed their legacy. And I kind of felt that, you know what, in this new age, we also needed another new generation of people making history that would make a difference. And so we started this foundation to develop these young, ethical, and smart leaders. And I think with my brother and I being involved in Toastmasters, we actually saw Toastmasters as an incubator that could help us towards our mission of starting 100,000 young, ethical, and smart leaders. And so, yeah, that's how we've both leveraged Toastmasters to actually advance our personal mission.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, of course, you've had successful growth in Africa, and I'm sure the growth hasn't been a straight line along the
Yeah.
way. I'm just curious if you could share perhaps maybe some of the growing pains that maybe you had gone through, things that maybe people didn't see from the outside.
Yeah, I think, you know what, it's nice when, like I said, we had one district in 2013 in Africa, and now we are up to five districts. And at some point, we were growing cross country and starting one new club in each place. But sometimes there's disadvantages of growing too fast or not growing systematically. One of the things that we know now is that sometimes it's not helpful to grow one club in isolation because each club goes through cycles. And so they need the support of other clubs just to make things work, whether it's clubs that are convenienced by the date in which they meet or the time they meet or the focus. You need to grow many clubs. One of the things that we do now is we've learned that it's actually important to grow areas than to grow clubs, because when you grow three or four clubs in one area, they will literally support each other to get through some of the growing pains that are necessary. But in some places where we don't have Toastmasters today, we actually used to have clubs in the recent past or in the past, but they died due to isolation. So that in itself became a bit of a challenge. The pandemic itself became another interesting challenge. In fact, there are people, there was a year when we had a district leadership team that had actually not experienced an in person district conference. And so now transitioning back to in person, we've got a generation of Toastmasters, given that we also have a very high turnover because some people, some of our members can't afford to be members for a long time for financial reasons or for trying to advance other goals. So we've got a whole new generation of Toastmasters that are not leveraging from the 100-year power that the organization brings. And 10, that when I joined Toastmasters, we had so many mentors who were experienced and were available to mentor people. But when people are coming in big droves, sometimes it's a challenge to support all of them in one go. Those are some of the growing pains that we are experiencing, and are hoping that we can create structures to sustain the growth on the continent.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned is very valuable, and I think the golden nugget there is, and it's something that can apply to any district anywhere in the world, is to don't focus on one individual club, but look at growing an area. That's something I've never heard before, and I think that that's extremely valuable. And folks, if you found this conversation valuable, I encourage you to share this episode with your friends and family and fellow Toastmasters. You can find the Toastmasters podcast at toastmasterspodcast.com, toastmasters.org, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere you get your podcast. Frank, I want to thank you so much for spending the time. And if someone would like to reach out to you, ask you some questions about growing the clubs or districts in Africa, or just curious about your journey, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Well, I'm on social media. You can reach out to me on Facebook, Frank Tsuro, my name, or on LinkedIn. My name still applies. Or you can email me on my email, ftsuro@toastmasters.org. F for Frank, and then Tsuro, which is my surname, at toastmasters.org. And I'll be happy to connect with you.
That's great, Frank. And I'll also put a link to your contact information in the show notes. And I will also put a link to the December 25 article called Family Ties and Toastmasters, Joining a Club Together Strengthens Bonds and Boosts Communication. And also don't forget to check out Paul Sturman's article in the April 2026 issue of the Toastmaster magazine entitled Africa's Ascent. The continent has soared in Toastmasters growth, visibility, and performance. Frank Tsuro, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, and all the best in your future endeavors. And maybe we'll see you one day on the world stage.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Greg.